Kellie-Jay Keen put women on the map. It was she who came up with the simple definition that then became a slogan. A woman is an adult human female. Restating that slogan, though it was a simple scientific truth, was held often to be hate speech in Britain. But in April of this year, it was vindicated by the UK Supreme Court, which ruled that the 2010 Equality Act referred specifically to women by biological sex and not by chosen gender identity. The court's decision marked the climax in a life of activism, one that had many difficult and dark moments. In 2023 in New Zealand, in the middle of a speaking tour, Kellie-Jay was set upon by a mob of transgenderism activists. Inadequate policing on the scene, a national media campaign against her. This was a classic case of intimidation by anarcho-tyranny. The footage went right around the world. Kellie-Jay went from being a British cultural figure to a global one. Kellie-Jay, if I may ask you this, what was going through your mind at this moment?
Well, I think, like many people in a really tricky situation like that, is you literally just think about your next actual physical step. And that's all I was really thinking. It was just one foot in front of the other. And then I remember sort of shouting like a seagull as we approached a bench, and I thought a lady in front of me was going to fall backwards. So that came through my mind. But I certainly, in the moment where the crowd became sort of a single organism, and I was beginning to go sort of 45 degrees, I thought, if I get to the floor, I'm never getting up. You know, I'm not going to see my husband and my children again. They will have lost me, and it's all my fault. I decided to come to New Zealand, and I genuinely thought I'd never get up. So I think that was it. And then when I got in the car, I say to the security in the moments after, do you think Wellington will be like this? And he sort of looked at me and said, yeah, we're not going. We're not doing another one.
I've actually myself been attacked and by a mob of PhD professors and university lecturers in Yale some years ago, and I found it extremely worrying at the time. The attackers were restrained by this kind of control system in us against violence, but it was breaking down. I could see they were beginning to hit me harder and harder. But as soon as I got in the car and away from them, and the police picked me up like a dirty laundry and threw me in the back of the car, I felt exhilarated actually for the next hour or two, and found it very exciting, but at the same time not something I wanted to do again. Now, when you look at those photographs, I have an odd question here, which is this really. Looking at them from the standpoint of, so to speak, social anthropology, do you think scenes like that could have occurred in 1910, in 1937, in 1955, in England, Australia, or New Zealand?
I think there have definitely been moments in history where I think those scenes could have happened, but not necessarily with the police standing right on the outskirts. Like the police had chosen not to go in where they knew it was dangerous for women. And I think the answer is yes, but not with the police quite so close. And they were right on the outskirts. So as soon as I got to sort of some sort of safety, the police were there. But that definitely had been an operational decision in maybe a moment in time where it can only happen where there's a really questionable and very sinister, worrying attitude to authority.
Well, you're, in a sense, treating this as a question of public order. But I'm really interested in the social psychology of it as well, because, yes, of course, there have always been, and presumably perhaps always will be, brutal attacks on women who are vulnerable to them. But the response of bystanders in previous times in England and I think the countries we're dealing with here would have been to protect you. And I didn't see much evidence of that on this occasion, which I think is very alarming indeed.
Yeah, well, there are some women that have talked about, some feminists that talk about something that happened to them in the sort of 60s and 70s, and they were expecting to talk to like-minded men, and they were invited to speak, and those men turned on them. So perhaps it's something from a particular supposed liberal left, anti-authority, well-educated contingent. And I don't think it would have happened had I been in a working class town. I don't think it would have been quite the same response. And I don't think men would have stood by or actually joined in. It was very many men that really did want to stomp out my existence. So, yeah, I think it's a particular type of person who probably thinks that they are righteous and therefore they have the right to do whatever they like to stop someone speaking if that person is going to say things they don't want to hear.
Well, I know you have received death threats on occasion, as have J.K. Rowling and other campaigners for women's rights. What about sympathetic messages? Did you receive much in the way of those after this incident?
Yes, I received messages from all over the world. There are some women that still can't watch the footage because they watched it live and they thought they were going to watch me lose my life, as did, fortunately, my children haven't watched it, won't watch it, didn't watch it. But my husband was watching, from the other side of the world. And so, yes, I received lots and lots of support.
Well, that is actually very encouraging, obviously. Now, how do you explain something else, however, which is the relatively tolerant attitude from the authorities, the media, the political figures in Australia and New Zealand towards what are clearly serious threats and assaults?
It's very difficult to try and get into the heads of somebody that can forgive that on the basis that they are on the right side of history. They are the right people. They are the nice, good folk. And so therefore, if you stand up, they use words like silence is violence and words are literal violence. And once you get there, as has happened throughout sort of authoritarian takeovers in any country, once you get to that point, then all bets are off for how bad the behaviour that they forgive is. And so, it's absolutely fine for people to threaten to punch me or want me dead, because I say absolutely terrible, terrible things. So it's perfectly justified as far as they're concerned. When it comes to the police, though, there was a training session at the Metropolitan Police where my name was mentioned and the whole room started booing. It's just crazy. But the police have been captured. I think it's weak leadership, and then something else comes along that fills a vacuum of weakness. And unfortunately, it's this.
Yes. There's clearly been elite capture, or rather, there's been activist capture of elite organizations, and that's one of the biggest problems, which I will get onto. But for the moment, have you had any apologies from some of the people who attacked you? For example, I think you went to law against the leader of the opposition in the state of Victoria because there was a row within the Liberal Party from people who wanted to support you. And then you were subjected to really quite insulting accusations of neo-Nazism and the rest.
No, I mean, he did a sort of apology, I guess, which meant that he could wriggle out of any financial penalty. But then he sort of doubled down and repeated the claims and justified those claims in the case that Moira Deeming, one of his own party, in the defamation suit, that she won rather magnificently to the tune of millions, when it costs included. So no, nobody's apologized. Nobody feels that they need to apologize. In fact, most people will just pretend that they never went along with it in the first place rather than apologize.
Well, that's disheartening, actually. Now, my impression is that before you got involved in this activist life, that you led a perfectly normal middle-class English life. Is that right?
I guess. I mean, I come from very much a working class family, but I went to university. I don't know which ticket it was that sort of propelled me into the middle class, but I stayed at home. My husband's also from a working class family, but I stayed at home and raised my 4 children, and I feel incredibly lucky that I had the choice to do that. And then this thing came along in 2015, and I simply had to do something about it. So yeah, I had a very charmed life.
Well, as a matter of fact, it sounds in many respects like a very typical post-war English life, because a lot of people have made that journey. But where did you go to university, for example? What did you read?
Well, I'm an atheist, but I studied theology at Leeds.
Ah, that's really interesting. Are you still an atheist? You remain one? Okay.
Yes, I am. I think you have more of a choice to be an atheist or not if you were raised with a religion, but I've never had a religion. So I think to have faith is something that's quite difficult if you've been raised as an atheist.
Well, sure, an atheist by default, so to speak. But having said that, the experience you had might, I suppose, have prompted some religious response from you, but it didn't do so. So that's interesting. Politics. Were you born into a political family?
Not especially, no. My parents were sort of teenagers when they married, and not. It's not like we sat around having political discussions as I was growing up at all. No.
I'll come into conventional party politics later, but what was the event that drew you into activism on behalf of women's rights? And when you became an activist, did you still think of yourselves as being on the left? Because some interview I saw, you described yourself as a lefty, a traditional lefty.
So in about 2015, the Conservatives were elected. I joined some lefty sort of online women-only forums. Men started pouring in who called themselves women. And I realized at that point that when you spoke up, you would get absolutely terribly attacked. And at that point, knowing that I wasn't allowed to talk about it, that became something that I really felt I must talk about. And that's really it. And then in all of the online groups that I was in, Labour groups, I was just kicked out for asking whether my daughter had the right to be in a female-only changing room and not see a naked adult male.
Well, you're describing there, you're drawn into this world of activism because the left actually was changing its own position. If we think of sexual politics in Britain, in the 60s and 70s, the feminists thought their natural home was on the left. There seemed to be no doubts about that. I was, as a more or less lifelong conservative, I had to accept that was the reality, so to speak, and it was always, so to speak, a problem. But But they now have reversed themselves on gay rights and on feminism. In order to accommodate the idea that transgender women are really women, even if they're biologically men, and they deserve to be treated as such. How did that change occur? You talked about your experience in discovering it, but while you're there, how does that happen? Were there not big rows among people on the left at this point? It seems to me it wasn't till later.
I think it probably was always going to happen, because I think the left is absolutely oozing with misogyny. And I don't think anybody notices until the day that you notice, and then everything sort of falls into place. And I wasn't particularly involved in politics. I voted for the Labour Party. I think that's about as far as I went. I didn't march. I wasn't an activist. I didn't go along to local political meetings. So I didn't actually mix with too many men from unions or all the other places where women had already been treated pretty badly by the left. And so I think it's the same as how Pi managed to get involved in groups like Liberty, that there's always this sort of pontificating over people's rights and having these sort of pseudo-intellectual conversations about how everybody can be happy and equal. I think it's a logical conclusion that you eventually get to a place where anything goes. And women are always going to be the first sort of group of people that have to compromise in order to enable anybody else.
Well, it seems to me that, in a sense, you're criticizing here what people like me would say is the utopianism of the left, that they're aiming at something which is unattainable, really, but trying to compel everyone else to go along with it. So let me therefore turn to something very practical, which is you are committed to defending the rights of women that were established in law in the 60s and 70s. Can you just explain what is at stake here?
I focused on language really, really early on. It was a case of sort of really thinking, what is it? Fundamentally, what is it that they want? Well, they want everything, and they want our language. And without language to describe us, we have no language to protect us or describe our rights or define us in any way, shape or form. So I really sort of focused quite sharply onto the word woman, meaning adult human female. And obviously, if you can take that word away, and they do it in two ways. Number one, everyone is a woman, and therefore nobody is a woman. And the other thing they do is places where women and woman would normally be used, they then use other words like cervix haver, menstruator, chest feeder, birthing person. And so they take our language away in two aspects. So, I mean, that's at stake. If we can't be described, we don't really exist. And then what follows from that is every single place where the word woman is used, where women's rights are sought and held, every one of those places is up for grabs. And even post Supreme Court clarification, which isn't an amendment or a change in the law, it simply means somebody finally described exactly what we all knew in the first place, because nobody made a law with gender reassignment in it and sex and meant that the two are interchangeable. It was simply just nonsensical to come up with any other conclusion that sex means biological sex and woman means adult human female. So I think everything's at stake. And I think it's not the only attack on women, but it is the most fundamental from which everything else flows.
Well, in fact, I congratulate you on adult human female. It's an absolutely brilliant slogan, because it's something that you look at and you suddenly realize that there's a logical structure there. It's very clear. Of course, if at the same time there are people with degrees and important positions in public life who are expressing mystification about what a woman is. It's a very, very clever, it's an argument in itself without seeming to be an argument in itself. So it's very, very effective as a slogan. Now, having said that, let me ask you about the organizations you founded, because you founded more than one, and what were they? And secondly, what is the one which you're heading today, and what does it do in particular?
Well, it started with Standing for Women, and it simply was called that because I was, a long time ago when this first sort of kicked off, I thought I might have a political party and we would call it Standing for Women, and it'd be wonderful. In the end, I just sort of sold T-shirts so I could raise enough money to put up a billboard with the dictionary definition of the word woman, and that really took off. It was very successful, and so in order to continue doing anything, I raised money through merchandise sales. And then I started doing talks at Speaker's Corner. And the reason I had to do that, so we were just gathering in halls, and then we were cancelled. We kept getting cancelled from halls. And so we would organise a talk, and we couldn't even guarantee that women would be able to meet because trans activists had found that if they targeted the venue would cancel and buckle like nearly every single time. So I thought and also I'd been cancelled online. So by that point, most of the online spaces where people were talking, I was banned from. So Twitter, for example, I was banned for sort of 4.5 years. Anyway, so I decided to go to Speaker's Corner, and we did a Standing for Women at Speaker's Corner. And it was just so vibrant, and I felt very much alive, and it really felt like we were taking back the public square. As opposed to the online public square. We were actually going back to the good old-fashioned speaking to people's faces. And I thought, well, I want to do this every month. And so I did. So I would turn up every month and women would come and speak. And then I decided to take it around the country and then around the world. So that morphed into Let Women Speak, simply because the women who came, once the trans activists came and tried to drown us out, the women just spontaneously started shouting, "Let women speak." And it felt like it was too perfect to not actually steal it and make the whole movement Let Women Speak, which is what I did. And then my second is that I have a political party called Party of Women.
And was this you're finding your métier at the Speaker's Corner? You suddenly found you could address an audience, presumably often very hostile. I've done it myself years ago, and it is kind of exhilarating, but it's also pretty terrifying the first time you go up there. So, did you just find you were here's what I do, in a way?
Yeah, I'd already done a bit of an online rant. I'd been to a feminist, so-called feminist group. What were they making? They were making political signs. Oh, it was so dreadful. It was very tie-dye and lentil weaving. And I came back and I was so incensed with how they behaved and the things they were saying that I just did a rant online. And I was very, very good at it, even if I do say so myself. So I can get very angry and remain articulate for quite a long period of time. And it chimed with people. And I think I got 50,000 views in sort of 24 hours until Facebook took it down. So I know I'm good at talking, and I used to do things on the stage. So I'm also a terrible show off. So going and doing something, running the gauntlet at Speaker's Corner, it's something I thoroughly enjoy. I don't particularly find it very frightening at all. It's quite exhilarating. So yeah, I think I'm quite good at it. So I enjoy it.
I think you are. Are you also a good organizer?
My husband would say no. Women who I work alongside would probably say yes. But I'm very good at ideas, and some of the more mundane elements of putting those ideas into practice, it's not my greatest skill set.
What are your relationships like with people who are, by accident or design, are your allies in this broader movement for women's rights? Is there a kind of executive committee of the female bourgeoisie which gets you, J.K. Rowling and Helen Joyce and others around a table in which you assign each other jobs? Obviously not quite that formal.
I'd love to say yes, but I find that I don't do well in committees because I have a very clear idea of exactly what I want to do. And I find that sitting down and having a chat about it and trying to organise something tends to take away the very laser focus that I've got. So I find myself often just saying, right, I'm going to do this, and then I just go and do it.
Well, as a matter of fact, whether or not there's any cooperation, formal or informal, there is no doubt that, in a sense, there's a good organisation in that you are all doing different things that you're good at, and it's having, I think, an important effect. What do you think, however, should be the role of men in this endeavour? I ask because earlier, of course, I talked about chivalry. Men have a specific obligation, it seems to me, to protect women. Let me quote you the Scottish mystic George MacDonald, who said, I think, it's the duty of every man to protect every woman from every man, starting with himself. And that's obviously an ideal which most men very rarely live up to fully. But nonetheless, it is an ideal. And do you have a view of what men should be doing in this area? Maybe nothing.
I do. On a sort of a personal level, I think men need to be the ones to talk to their children's schools or talk to the health care or health service where their mother is going to, wife is going to use, because often male voices, I'd like this not to be true, but it is true. So we might as well just live with it and use it to our advantage. But men do get listened to far more than women. I think women sometimes have this funny thing that happens from the moment that our voice leaves our mouths before it reaches somebody else's head. It's turned into something shrill, irritating and whiny. So I do think men have a role there. As far as the movement goes, I feel like I'm very much in a women's movement. So I will stand shoulder to shoulder with a man, or maybe he can stand just behind as a support. But I certainly don't fancy being led by men. But then I don't fancy being led by anyone, to be fair.
Well, that is fair enough. Let me move on to the wider question of relations between the sexes and the impact on that of the kind of social changes that have been going on, since the 60s. You have sometimes described yourself as a supporter of women's rights, and sometimes, but not always, as a feminist. Would you like to elaborate on that distinction?
I was a feminist for a very short period of time. And unfortunately, amongst the worst behaviour and the most badly behaved women I've ever come across, they also identify as feminist. And I felt that the label of feminist, and even the foundation of feminism, which I just can't get on board something that I feel really diminished motherhood. I can't do it. I think most of the world's women are mothers. I think there is a myth spread amongst feminists that motherhood means you've somehow not achieved. And I think the four most impressive things I've ever done are the children that I have. So I just can't get on board on that. But also I think once you're a feminist, you basically exclude many women who just then don't listen straight away. And I want every single woman to feel that she has a role to play in her own life about protecting her own rights, but also as part of this wider movement. I don't want any woman to think, well, I'm not going to listen to her because she's a feminist. So, yeah, I just find it quite limiting. And also, where I'm a mother, first and foremost, that's the first thing I am. And everything else is secondary.
Well, actually, then, the defense of the family, which until very recently was never the forefront of politics, but now is, partly because it's also under attack, that is a real new defining issue in politics, which side you're on. And I think that we are going to see the new politics that seems to be emerging in Britain at the moment is going to have the family as one of its major items of, controversy in a way, but also main items of policy and protection, really. But let me, without leaving this topic, let me go on to the wider question of the relations between the sexes. What do you think? Do you think that feminism, transgenderism, and all these other aspects of the sexual revolution and the sexual revolution itself is having a good or a bad influence on the relations between young people of both sexes, which seem sometimes to be almost poisonous compared to, for example, the relations that between boys and girls and young men and women, which prevailed, as late as the 80s and 90s?
I mean, I do. I think the role of men in society is up for grabs, really. And I think I meet a lot of women who talk about male toxicity and a whole array of things wrong with men. And then I'll say, well, what do you want from a man then? If you can list all the things that you don't want, but what is it that you do want? What is a man supposed to be? And the answer to that question is, we're not really sure. So I think it's quite difficult to be a young man and a young woman. I think bigger than transgenderism or feminism, I think a bigger ill for the cohesion of younger men and women is probably pornography. I think that has a fundamental damaging impact on our lives. And I mean, I'm quite lucky that I'm 50, but I can't imagine what it must be like to be like a 20-year-old woman or man, because I think men are coerced into thinking it's something that they should do frequently. And I think young women are probably being coerced to think that now. But yeah, feminism and men who support feminism, for whatever reason that might be, probably because it benefits them personally, in academia, I think has a terrible impact on young men. And will it continue? I don't think it will. I think human nature will certainly have its comeback. And eventually, people still get married, couples still get together and have children. So I'm quite hopeful that actually fundamental human behaviors and needs will rise to the top.
This is, of course, part, I think, of the politicization of life, of every aspect of life. It seems unimaginable. It would have seemed unimaginable to me that people would refuse to date someone of the opposite political persuasion. And yet this is now very strong, and particularly on the left. But anyway, let's move on. I want to ask you about, because you mentioned your family, you're married with 4 children, and do they support your campaigning? Are they enthusiastic for it? Or is it
yes.
an obstacle?
When my kids were at university, one of them is still at university, and I can't visit him. The first time I'll have gone anywhere near his university is when he graduates. So that's been a bit of a shame, and they can't say who their mum is in any sort of setting. They try and avoid to say who I am because it can make life quite difficult for them. And my husband has a business, so I have to be kept very far away from that as well. But aside from that, they obviously agree with me. The good thing is that I knew about this before my kids were being poisoned with it at school. So I had a heads up.
Well, I think it is, of course, shocking that people at university, particularly if they're at university and can think, are surprised that people have different points of view, but it's the way it is, I agree. You stood for Parliament the last election, and like most independents, of course, you didn't do very well. Do you actually have a political career in mind, apart from your activism?
Yeah, I mean, with the party, I just want to be a disruptor, and I want to create places to have conversations. That was the main goal of starting a political party, because, you can only get so far by speaking to people in the street. And and I've got quite a good online presence, but there's only so much you can do. And if you're not in the thick of political conversations when we can have them, then you're failing in your duty to reach as many people as possible. Plus, by fielding candidates, we managed to get about 1 million leaflets and pamphlets through people's doors. So more and more people got to hear about it. Because I think everyone agrees with me. I think it's maybe 5% of the population genuinely don't agree. I think most of them agree, but they have no idea that you can even say these things, or that you can't say these things. Like, some people are totally out of the loop. They have no idea that this is going on whatsoever. So, it's always been my ambition to tell as many people as possible. I think I'm the person to raise the alarm.
Well, as a matter of fact, I think that that's a very fair self-description. But I'd also say that the period in which people felt afraid to express their opinions, in Britain at least, is coming to an end. And we'll talk about this, but you're in politics anyway, in a sense. And I wonder, I'd like to discuss your other political views. I mean, shouldn't you be attracted to a party that had the first woman prime minister and then the second woman prime minister, and today has a woman as the leader of the opposition who is also from a different ethnic background, from family in Nigeria? So, I mean, this seems to me, and particularly in view of your remarks on the family and so on, to be the party, or one of the parties anyway. You have a choice among Conservatives between the Tories and Kemi, or Nigel Farage and Reform. Are you not attracted to these parties, which seem to me to be attracted to you?
Well, I started as a single issue campaigner, and I really couldn't commit to any party that wasn't going to deliver at least on my one issue, which is repealing the GRA. I think in order to eradicate the UK from this nonsense, you'd have to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. You'd have to get rid of the Gender Recognition Act and probably obliterate the Equality Act. I'm in favour of all those things. Now, I know Reform are making noises about that. And I wish the Conservatives could be conservative again, because I think I probably would be quite attracted to them. But, they've said things about as many hours as possible for children in daycare. And I just... maybe I will in a few years. I'd like to find a home in the Conservative Party. I'd like the Conservative Party to be the party it was when I was growing up, at least identifiably something other than this sort of uniparty that I think it delivers at the moment. It's a little indecipherable. And then you've got the Labour Party, which is sort of playing... like, they've got a political technician, so they just keep pivoting. They say things, but they don't do things. And it's, I think people are easily fooled. But yes, if the Conservatives could come out to be super conservative and identifiable, then I would definitely consider.
And Reform? And Reform and Nigel Farage?
Yeah, well, if they want to invite me, then I'm sure I would find a home there. It's just got to be right for women. I'm interested in the safety of women. I think that it comes across many other issues. I think having hotels of illegal migrants, of men making the streets unsafe for women, I think that's something that anybody who claims to care about women at all, that should not be happening. So I'd need to see some really firm policies, but if I could get a bigger platform for the things that I want to achieve, then of course I would join any party that was going to do that.
As I'll bring this line of questioning to an end, but with one last question, though, because I am a Conservative myself, which means at the moment I can see a future in being attracted to vote for either Reform or the Conservatives, of whom I'm, so to speak, a disappointed supporter. But here's the question. I remember supporting women-only railway carriages in the 60s, on the grounds that obviously women did sometimes need to be protected against drunks and unpleasant people on long journeys. And at that time, of course, feminists were wanting to abolish all of these distinctions. And my question is really, maybe the campaign you need to consider embarking on is how do we restore among men, this goes back to an earlier point, how do we restore among men the chivalry that was once part of our education? And if so, what should the women's reaction to men who have, to such education for men, be on the woman's side? You partly answered that when we asked about young people, but it seems to me to be a key question. After all, laws are one thing, but how small the part that laws or rules may cure. It's really, if we are going to succeed in creating a better society, a lot of it has to come from inside ourselves.
I just think there's a disconnect between maybe what is actually happening and what is talked about online. Because I would argue that normal people, like normal people that you talk to, they aren't getting all upset about a man opening a door. Whereas online, you'd think that women were practically having a breakdown every time somebody said, can I carry something for you? Or can I take the bins out? I've had this discussion before with women because I said that I just don't believe women genuinely want this weird equality where they would go downstairs if there was a noise in the middle of the night. You know, I just don't believe it. And some woman said, oh, but that's not equality. And I said, okay, well, I won't have equality when it comes to dangerous men in my house. I'll just send my husband. So I think most women do want to be looked after. I think it's a lie. I think it's a university sort of spread myth. And that will come down to feminists, for example, who are more offended by a man maybe spreading his knees too far apart on a train rather than a man derobing in a women's changing room. So I think it's just lies. I think it's performative. And I don't actually think it happens in real people's lives. So I think we just maybe ought to stop pretending that there is this thing where women don't want men to be chivalrous, because I just don't buy it.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time here, so I've got three final questions. The first is a straightforward political one about the people on the other side in the sense of civilization. Can I have your thoughts on the silent and almost unnoticed way the woke revolution proceeded, and ask you, do you think woke revolution, which seems to control any number of major British institutions, is over, or should there be, or is it still powerful?
I think it's still very powerful. I think there's still quite a lot of money. I mean, we might be at the beginning of the end, but I think it's still very powerful because there's just too much money and power in it, and people don't want to give those things up. But I think more ordinary people are recognizing it, but now these people think that they've got some sort of real fight on their hands, and so I think they'll sort of really dig their heels in, and that's why you need a really seriously strong government, which I don't believe we have, to finally just, put the toys away, if you like.
My penultimate question is about your resilience in the face of attacks. I just read your Wikipedia entry today, and it seemed to me nothing but an artfully written stream of slanders. And I was amazed, and I'm not naive about those kind of things, but this seemed to me to be so hostile as to be, first of all, incredible, not believable, and secondly, shameful, given its Wikipedia's claims. So how do you remain resilient? And because you have a lot to be resilient about.
I don't know the answer to that. I think I just am. I think I have a mission. I have an aim, and I'm not letting some silly slanderous kind of words stop me because I'm right. And I know I'm right and they know I'm right, which is why they keep going after me. Also, I'm at the end stages of having 4 teenagers all at once. So I'm, you know, I've had a few battles on a daily basis. So I'm pretty well practiced. But there's nothing you can do either. I mean, really, when somebody that you don't really know says some things about you that aren't true, and I successfully sued the Independent newspaper because they repeated some lies. I think I'm one of the first to successfully do that. But aside from that, there's nothing you can do. So you might as well just carry on. I mean, I guess as soon as you raise your head above the parapet, you will receive both praise that you don't really deserve, lots of like really amazing things said about me that aren't necessarily true, and some really terrible things about me that also aren't true. So I try and treat them with both the same.
Well, I should have mentioned in my question about wokeness, I've just written a book called Sleepwalking into Wokeness, which I thoroughly recommend. But that's just by way of the fact that I'm never thinking enough about myself. Now, how would you adapt if all your claims, all your arguments, all your aims and objectives were finally recognized, were fully achieved? Not very likely, but it might happen. Would you just relax into a life of holidays, tennis, sleeping in deck chairs and so on? Or would you find another cause? Have you become, so to speak, somebody who, like Florence Nightingale, so to speak, wants to change the world for the better?
I probably do now. I always used to think that once this was done, I'd go back to my life. But my children, my youngest was 8 when I started this, and he's now 16. So I'm probably not as needed as I was. And I am very, very worried since October the 7th. I'm very, very worried about the public display and authoritarian creep and rise of Islam, and particularly how it impacts women, both Muslim women and other women in the UK. And it's also another topic that you're not allowed to talk about. And I think I've found that a lot of people will stay silent on things that they know to be really quite wrong. And I'm not one of them. So I feel it's my duty to speak up. But just pivoting back very quickly to the whole Christianity thing, somebody said to me, a very religious man said to me that sometimes you find God through the presence of the devil. And I feel that I'm closer to thinking that there is evil afoot than ever before. So you never know. Maybe I'll have a whole transformation within 5 years.
Well, I certainly think you've transformed a lot already. So it may well be that the final victory is going to be within your own soul. You do remind me of another campaigning woman very strongly, and I look forward to seeing what you campaign about next. And I very much enjoyed this interview. Thank you for doing it.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to meet you.